On a windy October night in 1995, a mysterious house fire swept through the palatial home of a doctor and his family. 2 of the family members made it out alive. 2 of the children did not. In the debris, medical detectives discovered much more than simply how the fire started. Michael Farrar and Deborah Green first met in medical school in 1977. Both were gifted students with near-genius IQs. There was an instant attraction, and they married less than a year after they met. Over the next 16 years, the couple raised 3 children, Jennifer, Timothy, and Kelly, in an affluent suburb of Kansas City, Kansas. To outsiders, their lives seemed perfect, but the marriage was showing signs of stress. At the North Kansas City Hospital, Dr. Michael Farrar was a successful heart specialist who worked very long hours, often at the expense of time with his children. Deborah quit her own medical practice when the children were born. She battled depression, weight gain, and was rumored to have a drinking problem.
You got the impression that Deborah wasn't the easiest person in the world to live with. She was, I don't want to say, well, let's just leave it at that.
In an effort to rekindle their marriage, the couple decided to go on a school trip to Peru with their son, Tim. While sightseeing along the Amazon River and among the Incan remains, an attractive blonde nurse caught Michael's attention. She was the mother of one of the other students. When they returned to Kansas City, Michael continued to see his new friend, which soon blossomed into a sexual affair. It didn't take Deborah long to find out about her husband's affair. She moved into a separate bedroom, and her drinking increased.
Her whole identity was her marriage and her family, because she no longer had her own career. I felt that, maybe it was just really hard for her to let go of that. Maybe she felt like she could change, or something could change, and they could somehow stay together.
And Michael had some serious problems of his own. Shortly after the Peru trip, Michael developed diarrhea, vomiting, and chills so severe he was admitted to the local hospital.
He'd been in South America, where he might have had access to a whole variety of things that could make him very sick.
Despite undergoing a full battery of tests, doctors could not determine the cause of Dr. Farrar's illness.
When I saw him, it's like, Mike, man, you look bad. I'm sorry, but you don't look good. And he said he'd been really, really violently ill since he had gotten back from Peru, and he assumed that he had gotten some tropical parasite from hell.
Michael Farrar was rapidly losing weight, dropping to just 125 pounds. Whatever was causing this illness was a mystery. For a cardiologist who seemingly had it all, Dr. Michael Farrar's life in 1995 was one crisis after another. When he was released from the hospital for the illness many believed he caught in Peru, Michael took another step towards divorce by moving into his own apartment across town. His wife Deborah was angry, depressed, drinking heavily, and would stay in her bedroom for days at a time. Michael was concerned for her welfare as well as the safety of their 3 children. While visiting the house to pick up some of his things, Michael noticed something suspicious in his wife's purse. A packet of castor beans. On the label was a warning that the beans were poisonous. With so many packets of castor beans in her purse, Michael suspected that his wife was planning to commit suicide.
So he was telling me that he was pretty sure she was going to try and kill herself with these poisons, which really, to me, didn't make any sense, because Dr. Green is a bright woman. I mean, she's an extremely bright woman, and is an oncologist. And if you're a doctor, I mean, doctors kill themselves, all right? I mean, and professional people do commit suicide. But fortunately, we've got the best of drugs available to us. I mean, if you're going to go, why would you go stooling yourself to death? I mean, you aren't going to want to die with bloody diarrhea. I mean, that is a very horrible, bad way to die.
I asked throughout the house, as I have on this one, the heat was tremendous. There was no way that anyone could even get close to the house. Of course, the flames were roaring out probably 20 to 30 feet.
Deborah and her 10-year-old daughter Jennifer both escaped. During questioning on the night of the fire, Deborah learned the tragic news that her other 2 children had been trapped and died in the fire.
Oh God, beautiful Tim and beautiful Kelly are both dead? Jesus Christ, did they make any attempt at all to save them?
6-year-old Kelly died of smoke inhalation in her own bed. 13-year-old Tim burned to death.
Christ, I saved one of the kids, and I could have gotten the second one out and didn't. I'll never forgive myself for that.
Investigators immediately suspected arson.
It's fair to say that Deborah Green was a suspect early on. It's fair to say that Mike Farrar was a suspect early on.
Both had motive. Both had opportunity. If the fire had been deliberately set, the charge would be more than arson. It would be murder. While investigating the suspicious house fire that killed Tim and Kelly Farrar, police looked a little deeper into the relationship between Michael and his estranged wife, Deborah. A few weeks before the fire, the couple had a fight at the house. Michael said his wife was intoxicated, angry, and threatening to kill herself. The police were called and took Deborah to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Pamela McCoy was the physician on duty.
Pam McCoy indicated that at first she was somewhat skeptical about whether or not Deborah Green was really that mentally ill, and is sitting there in the waiting room of the KU Medical Center emergency room talking to Deborah Green about these issues, asking her if she's okay, if there's anything she can do to help her, and trying to get a read on her mental state. When in walks Michael Farrar.
When they met in our kind of entryway there, she just like turns on him like she's, I mean, for a minute I kind of hold her like I think she's going to physically attack him, and she spits at him and calls him a hole. And then she says, "You're going to get these kids over their dead bodies."
Deborah said she made the statement in anger and denied having anything to do with the fire. She said she was asleep when the fire alarm sounded. She said she opened the bedroom door, saw flames and smoke, closed the door, and ran outside through a door in the bedroom. Deborah said she told her son Tim to stay inside until firemen arrived and ran to the next door neighbor's house for help. To find out whether an accelerant or flammable liquid was used in starting the fire, arson investigators used specially trained dogs that can identify vapors which remain after the fire.
This is a dog that has been through several weeks of training on how to detect different types of liquid accelerants like diesel fuel or kerosene or gasoline or charcoal lighter fluid.
The dogs identified a number of suspicious areas. Investigators found melted plastic containers on the floor, possibly used to carry flammable liquids throughout the house. Next to Dr. Farrar's desk, investigators found another clue that the fire had been intentionally set.
We found an empty liquor bottle laying on the floor right behind this desk. Again, it's possible that the contents of this bottle were poured out and ignited on the desk.
A section of the basement floor had what appeared to be a pour pattern, where an accelerant was ignited as a test. The accelerants also gave investigators a clear path of the fire. The path led directly to Deborah Green's bedroom door.
That fire was set at that bedroom door with the intent of doing a tremendous amount of damage to that house and cutting off the escape route of those children upstairs.
And the analysis of the burn patterns on the bedroom door contradicted Deborah Green's story. Deborah said her bedroom door was closed when the fire alarm sounded and that she closed the door before running outside for help. But the carpet underneath the door revealed the door had been open. The door jamb revealed the same thing. If the door had been closed, the door jamb would have been protected from the fire. Instead, it was completely covered with soot. In the bathroom was Deborah's bathrobe, wrapped in a ball on the floor. On the underside of the robe were burn marks. At some point, the person wearing the robe had been very close to the flames. The neighbors said Deborah's hair was wet when she ran over asking for help. This did not come as a surprise to arson investigators.
When Dr. Green actually ignited that accelerant outside of her bedroom door and in the hallway, that there was enough vapors present that there was quite a flash, more of a flash than she probably was prepared for. When she did that, I believe that is when she got the hair singed on the right side of her head.
With a search warrant, detectives took a sample of Deborah's hair. Microscopic analysis revealed that Deborah's hair showed signs of heat damage consistent with singeing from a high-intensity flame. The damage to Deborah's hair was extensive since the sample wasn't collected until after she had her hair cut for her children's funeral. Bill Chapin is a forensic chemist whose job was to analyze the fire debris evidence from the Farrar home. Fire debris is stored in metal canisters which preserve any vapors which may still be present. The canisters are heated to between 80 and 90 degrees centigrade, and the air inside removed. If the vapors contain accelerants or hydrocarbons, they're trapped in charcoal filters. The filters are then rinsed with a neutral solvent, carbon disulfide, and the mixture is placed into a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer for analysis. After 2 days of testing, Bill Chapin found what he was looking for.
In this particular case, the accelerant that I found was an accelerant called isoparaffin. Isoparaffins are often used in odorless charcoal lighter fluids.
There was an empty container of charcoal lighter fluid on the floor of the Farrars' garage. Investigators were now convinced that Deborah Green set the fire that killed 2 of her children. The only question that remained, had she also tried to kill her husband with castor beans? When Dr. Michael Farrar told police he was sure his wife had been poisoning him with castor beans, investigators were unsure of where to start. Since the local laboratory could find no evidence of ricin in Michael Farrar's system, his blood was sent to the FBI, to Dr. Drew Richardson, an expert in chemical and biological research at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Washington, D.C.
People in the intelligence community are quite familiar with ricin based on a handful of cases that most everybody would know about. Very few people in the lay public and even highly trained professionals such as medical doctors would be quite unlikely to know much about ricin, if anything.
Ricin is an antigen that causes a breakdown of red blood cells at the tissue level. In large enough doses, it can be fatal. When an antigen enters the body, the immune system's response is to produce antibodies which fight the invading organism. To find out whether ricin antibodies were in Michael Farrar's system, Dr. Richardson used a technique called ELISA, which stands for enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. A 96-well plastic plate is coated with a solution containing ricin. In theory, any ricin antibodies in Dr. Farrar's blood would bind to the ricin coated on the plate, which is exactly what happened. Next, Dr. Richardson analyzed the blood of goats that had been exposed to small amounts of ricin. It appeared that the goats and Michael Farrar both had similar antibodies in their systems, antibodies designed and structured to recognize and seek out the target invader, ricin. Dr. Richardson discovered something else. The number of ricin antibodies in Farrar's system was staggering.
In the case of Dr. Michael Farrar, it's thought that perhaps he was exposed 3 times. A certain immune response would have been produced the first time, a response that would have lasted a few weeks. On second and third, and perhaps other exposures, a separate immune response would have been produced for each one of those exposures, and the latter exposures would have produced a response and antibodies that would be present in the blood for, again, many months to perhaps a few years.
Deborah Green was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Prosecutors believe that when Deborah's attempts to kill her husband failed, she feared losing custody of her children in the impending divorce.
I don't have to listen to this.
After the argument on the telephone, prosecutors believe that Deborah poured accelerants throughout the house, with special attention to Michael's possessions and making sure to cut off the children's escape route. The path of the accelerants led directly to the door of Deborah Green's bedroom. But she used too much accelerant. The vapors ignited, causing a mini explosion that singed her hair. While dousing her head with water, she saw that her bathrobe had also caught fire and discarded it. Ten-year-old Jennifer survived by crawling out her bedroom window and jumping to the ground. Deborah told Tim to stay inside with his 6-year-old sister until firemen arrived. Sadly, Tim did what his mother had told him to do. He and Kelly both died before firemen could reach them. Deborah Green's trial was scheduled to begin 1 week after Michael's brain operation to repair damage caused by the ricin poisoning. But the trial never took place. Deborah Green pleaded no contest to the charges, avoiding a possible death sentence.
My attorneys are ready, willing, and able to present evidence that I was not in control of myself when Tim and Kelly died. However true that may be, defending myself at trial on these charges would only compound the suffering of my family and my daughter.
She was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for 40 years.
Well, I think these kids in this case were sort of the ultimate pawn, the ultimate weapon that Deborah Green used in this fight with Michael Farrar. She, in some ways, probably loved those kids, in other ways viewed them as an expendable resource to be used in this war.
Shirley and Ed Andronowicz were regulars in a neighborhood bar a few blocks from their home in Winnipeg, Canada. On one of their nights out, Ed decided to leave early. Shirley wanted to stay. There was a brief argument, and Ed went home alone. It was Shirley Andronowicz's last night alive. They lived in the Fort Rouge section of Winnipeg, Canada, with their 3 teenage daughters.
They went out that night together, and just as usual, they went out for a good time. And I guess a few hours later, my dad came home. He was tired, he didn't want to be there anymore.
of what was discovered there.
They came to the door, and I went and got my father. I went upstairs. Then I got called downstairs, and the police looked at my father and said, "Do you want to tell her?" And he just kind of hung his head and kind of nodded, and they told me. They told me that, you know, we found your mother and she's been killed.
Shirley Adronowicz had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and mutilated, with bite wounds over much of her body. It appeared that she had been strangled, then hit with a large piece of concrete.
There was the destruction of the facial features, and there was an obvious sexual assault had taken place. So this was a definite gruesome scene.
I've been a prosecutor for 23 years, and I have never seen any case with as much brutality to a human body.
In a written statement, Ed Andronowicz admitted that he argued with his wife that night, but said he had no idea what happened to her after she left their home. Homicide investigators Bob Marshall and Ron Oliver decided to question Ed Andronowicz again to learn more about what happened on the night Shirley Andronowicz was murdered.
At one point, he was sort of asked in a sort of a helpful sort of a question to him if he had any idea who may have killed his wife.
12:30 in the morning.
The answer Andronowicz gave was a bombshell. He said he was the murderer.
He actually had some knowledge of some of the aspects of the crime. For example, he knew where the body was. He knew that it was in behind the Grant Park High School.
And I was angry with the police. I mean, they thought it was my dad, and I was angry with people who thought it could even be my father, because I knew it wasn't. And not only should they just, you know, knowing my father, know that he could not have done that, but trust my word, even though I was only 14.
To make absolutely sure, police questioned Andronowicz again on the following day, and again he confessed. Ed Andronowicz was charged with second-degree murder. Ed Andronowicz was held in a Winnipeg jail after confessing to the murder of his wife. Although parts of his confession were inconsistent with the murder scene, Andronowicz said he had been drinking on the night of the murder and his memory wasn't entirely clear. Police began their forensic investigation by turning to Dick Monroe, a forensic geologist with the Winnipeg Police Department. The murder weapon was a 55-pound concrete block found near the body.
His trunk was full of concrete particles. And that was exciting at the outset because he saw all this concrete, but the trick was, can you match the concrete to the block? Can you put that block in his trunk?
The process was tedious since there were hundreds of particles recovered from Andronowicz's trunk, all very small.
Because the murder weapon was rough, because it was a broken piece of concrete, you're looking for, like a jigsaw puzzle, a piece that would fit onto it. Could you get a physical match?
But Monroe was unable to find a match. Next, police sent photographs of the victim's bite wounds to Dr. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist at the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver. Ed Andronowicz wore dentures which were also sent for analysis.
The question that came up obviously was, can artificial teeth in the form of a complete upper and lower denture actually bite hard enough to remove human tissue?
Dr. Sweet performed a metric analysis measuring the width and arch of Andronowicz's dentures to see if they were similar to the bite wounds on Shirley Andronowicz's body. But Dr. Sweet could find few similarities.
I think at that point we were all leery of whether we had the right person or not. I know I had a question in my own mind as to whether we had the right person.
During Shirley Andronowicz's autopsy, the medical examiner had swabbed the areas around the bite wounds for possible forensic evidence. The swabs were rolled in a moistened filter paper, and the paper turned white, a positive presumptive test for the presence of saliva. The next step was to determine the blood type of the saliva.
We had a new technique at our disposal called ELISA, which allowed us to type saliva in the ABO blood typing factors.
The ELISA test revealed that the perpetrator had type B blood. This did not match Ed Andronowicz's blood type.
Therefore, Mr. Andronowicz, being of blood type A, could not have left the B-type saliva found on the swabs from the breast. Thereby, meaning he could not have been, in my mind, the murderer.
After 2 months in prison for a murder he confessed to, but apparently didn't commit, Andronowicz was released.
Feel better today? You happy to be outside?
But why had he confessed?
Andronowicz back at that time had a terrible problem with alcohol. And when the detectives interviewed him, and they asked him such questions as, "Did you have a fight with your wife last night?" he responded and said, "Well, I might have." And then when they went on and pressed him and said, "Well, did you hit her?" he said, "I might have."
Memory lapses while drinking are called blackouts and happen because alcohol interferes with the neurotransmissions that form memory in the brain.
And when they come out of the blackout, it's the realization, the recollection, all of a sudden that something bad may well have happened. And it's very common for alcoholics to feel remorse, express guilt, even imagine that they have done terrible things during the blackout period.
Now the police investigation had to start all over again. The murder weapon was a 55-pound piece of concrete. To forensic geologist Richard Monroe, it appeared to be about 5 years old and looked as if it had once been part of a bumper block used in parking lots. Monroe decided to visit the murder scene to survey the area. He went around midnight to evaluate the scene the way it appeared at the time of the murder. Standing where the body was discovered, Monroe wondered what exactly took place. If the victim had been strangled and was unconscious, what happened next? Where did the concrete block come from? Then Monroe saw it, an illuminated area about 500 feet away. In the shadows, Monroe found a piece of concrete. About 12 feet away was another piece. Both were similar to the murder weapon. The killer had been drawn to the area by lighting, his only visual cue. To prove his theory, Monroe needed to find out whether the murder weapon and the pieces in the schoolyard had once been part of the same block. Monroe performed a petrographic examination. Petrography is the term for identification of minerals. Concrete is made of sand, cement, water, and pieces of stone, which is poured into molds to form the bumper blocks. As it dries, the mixed design settles into a distinctive pattern, which is visually different in each concrete block. When Monroe compared the murder weapon to the other concrete pieces found in the schoolyard, the mixed design and position of the stones were identical.
The fit was almost like a glove. When you get broken aggregates in your sand and gravel inside your concrete, it'll break, and it's usually an irregular surface, and you'll have some what they call class small stones that will break out of the concrete mold, and what you're trying to do is fit that in, and it's not just one fit, it's a collection of fits.
Monroe suspected that the murder weapon might contain a fingerprint, but lifting a print from a porous surface like concrete is extremely difficult.
It's almost like a fingerprint is sitting on top of a bed of nails. So your latent material, which is very, very thin, is sitting on top of something that is very, very tenuous.
As a last resort, Monroe decided to try a technique usually used to find prints on non-porous surfaces called superglue fuming. Superglue is made of cyanoacrylate ester. A drop of superglue is placed into a chamber along with the item containing the print, and the chamber is heated for up to 6 hours. By heating the superglue, fumes condense and adhere to biological materials such as the oils of a fingerprint. Under a laser light, the biological material fluoresces, producing a clear image of the print. Monroe followed these steps with the concrete, placing both the superglue and the concrete in a vacuum chamber. But the color of the concrete is the same as the cyanoacrylate. In order to see a print, Monroe needed to find a chemical that would attach itself to the cyanoacrylate. After a number of tries, Monroe finally found one that worked. It was a biological stain known as Sudan black. Monroe found what he was looking for: the killer's fingerprint, but it was badly smudged.
Unfortunately, with the circumstances of the event, with the end of it being used as a pile driver and repeated blows on the victim, there was a certain amount of slippage taking place with a 55-pound block on the hands.
But the discovery of the related concrete pieces in the schoolyard was important. It revealed that it was a crime of opportunity, and that the perpetrator may have been on foot. But a full year passed, and the trail was turning cold. 1 year after the crime, local television stations and newspapers carried stories about the unsolved murder, hoping to jog someone's memory or conscience. The media campaign led to the break police were hoping for. One year after the brutal murder of Shirley Andronovich, an informant came forward saying that his roommate had returned home on the night of the murder with stains on his jeans and boots that looked like blood.
I'm gonna take a shot.
They lived in an apartment building across the street from the murder scene. Mark Jarman was a 29-year-old unemployed construction worker. The informant also revealed that Jarman had burned his clothes the day after the murder. Samples of Jarman's blood and saliva were sent to the forensic lab. Tests revealed that Mark Jarman had type B blood, the same blood type as the saliva found on the victim. Photographs and impressions of Jarman's teeth were also sent for analysis. Jarman had a distinctive wear pattern that had ground the biting edge of the upper and lower teeth into a flattened surface. There were also some unusual spaces between the teeth, and several chipped areas had not been restored.
As a result of some of the testing that I did and the comparison with the suspect's teeth, I was able to determine that his teeth were in fact consistent with causing these marks, Or another way to explain that is his teeth could not be excluded in this case as causing those marks.
Finally, police had a shopping list they found in the schoolyard on the night of the murder. It was a big schoolyard, and police weren't sure whether the shopping list had any connection to the murder. On the shopping list was a fingerprint. That print belonged to Mark Jarman, placing him in the schoolyard around the time of the murder. After initially denying he was involved, Mark Jarman eventually confessed. Jarman said he was at the same bar as Shirley and Ed Andronowicz on the night of the murder, but he didn't speak to them. He said he ran into Shirley Andronowicz later near the high school while she was out walking.
Didn't I see you at the bar before?
Jarman said they talked and had consensual sex. Jarman said he killed Shirley Andronowicz when she threatened to tell her husband. Jarman said he emptied the contents of her purse to make the scene appear to be a robbery. But investigators didn't believe Jarman's entire story. Staff Sergeant Dan Rawn is a blood spatter expert who studied the crime scene photos and noticed an inconsistency in Jarman's story. The distance blood travels from a head wound struck by an object the size and weight of a cement block is 10 to 12 feet, creating medium velocity impact spatter. On the papers found within 10 to 12 feet of Shirley Andronowicz's body, Ron discovered medium velocity impact spatter.
The pictures of the evidence actually showed that the contents of her purse had been strewn around at some location in a position where they were exposed to the bloodletting.
Which meant that Shirley Andronowicz's purse was ransacked before she was murdered, not afterwards. Mark Jarman was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years.
He took my mother. I was 14 years old. It's almost half my life. You know, I've been without her now. And you can't, I don't know how I'm ever supposed to forgive somebody for doing such a terrible thing to me. There isn't a punishment severe enough that we can give this guy for taking something like that from us. Not a day goes by when she doesn't come into my mind. I just think about what it would have been like if she was still here. I miss her.
The call came in just before dawn, the kind of call that slices through sleep and leaves a metallic taste in the mouth, the kind that never really fades even years later, because it began with a pause, a breath held too long, and then a sentence that would fracture time itself. There's something in the woods, and it doesn't look like it belongs there. In rural Virginia, autumn 1986. Fog still clinging low to ground. The air sharp with wet leaves and silence. A hunter had stepped off the trail, chasing a sound he couldn't place. A snapping branch, maybe, or the echo of his own footsteps. And that's when he saw it, half hidden beneath a lattice of fallen branches, pale against the dark earth, unmoving, wrong. By the time deputies arrived, the sun was climbing but offered no warmth, only light enough to confirm what instinct already knew, that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't nature taking its course. This was a life interrupted and left behind like a discarded secret. Word traveled fast, faster than the cruisers on the narrow roads, faster than the official statements that would follow. Because small communities had their own currents, and by noon the town was vibrating with it, the shock, the fear, the whispered question passing from mouth to mouth like contraband. Who would do this? And could they do it again? The victim's name would soon be printed on flyers and murmured in kitchens and classrooms. A young woman, local, known, the kind of name that carried weight because it belonged to someone with routines, with friends, with a face people recognized in line at the grocery store or waving from a passing car. Her disappearance the night before had already raised alarms, already tightened nerves. But hope still clung to the edge's end. The idea that she might walk to the door apologetic and safe, that this was all some misunderstanding. That hope evaporated the moment the scene was secured. Yellow tape fluttering uselessly against the vastness of the woods. Officers standing stiff and silent. The reality sinking in like cold water. Evidence markers bloomed across the ground. Each one a promise that answers were possible. Each one also a reminder how much had already been lost. The body told its own story, but not enough, never enough. And the silence of forest swallowed the rest. Investigators moved quickly, as they always do at first, canvassing the area, knocking on doors, collecting statements that blurred together in the notebooks, neighbors reporting unfamiliar cars, strange noises, half-remembered figures in the dark. The victim's last known movements were traced and retraced, timelines sketched and erased. The final hours becoming a kind of sacred ground everyone tiptoed around, afraid to disturb what little clarity there was. Friends spoke of plans made and never kept, of a phone call that ended too abruptly, of a sense that something had been off, though no one could say exactly what. Family members clung to details, to the smallest fragments, because in the absence of answers, details become lifelines. Every scrap of information was logged, bagged, labeled, stored with the confidence of an era that believed diligence alone could conquer darkness. But cracks appeared almost immediately. The woods were vast, the area remote, the night before poorly documented. Rain had fallen, washing away footprints, smearing tire tracks into ambiguity. Witnesses contradicted each other without meaning to, memory already bending under the weight of fear and suggestion. The autopsy raised questions it couldn't fully resolve, timelines that overlapped in uncomfortable ways, possibilities branching outward like an endless map. Was this someone she knew, someone who had earned her trust, or a stranger who saw opportunity in isolation? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, even as investigators assured the public that all angles were being pursued, that there was no immediate danger. Reassurance rang hollow in a town that had never needed it before. As days turned into weeks, the initial surge of urgency settled into something more methodical, more desperate beneath the surface. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, each one demanding attention, each one carrying the hope that it might be the key. A man seen at a gas station, a truck heard speeding away, a rumor about a troubled outsider passing through. Names were checked, alibis tested, some cracking under pressure, most holding firm. Polygraphs were administered with the solemnity of ritual, results debated in quiet rooms where coffee went cold and tempers flared. For every lead that seemed promising, there were 10 that collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind only exhaustion and the creeping realization that the trail was cooling faster than anyone wanted to admit. The community changed in subtle but permanent ways. Doors locked earlier. Parents hovered closer. Nighttime lost its innocence. Candlelight vigils brought people together, faces illuminated by flickering flames and shared grief. But even those gatherings carried an undercurrent of unease, eyes scanning the crowd, wondering who might be hiding something, wondering if the person responsible was standing just a few feet away, blending in, listening. The victim became both a symbol and a wound, her image fixed in time while everything else moved forward without her, birthdays passing uncelebrated, seasons turning with cruel indifference. Behind the scenes, evidence was cataloged and shelved, preserved according to the best practices of the time, a physical archive of unanswered questions. Fibers, hair samples, bloodstains, all carefully stored with the belief that someday, somehow, they might speak more clearly. But technology has its limits, and in 1986 those limits were stark. Forensic science could suggest, could exclude, could narrow, but it could not yet name. Investigators leaned on intuition, on experience, on the slow grind of human analysis, and when that failed to deliver, frustration set in, followed by doubt. Resources thinned, attention drifted, new cases demanded priority. Fresh crises pulled focus away from the old, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, This one began its descent into that dreaded category, the one no investigator ever wants to admit aloud. Cold case. The file grew thicker even as progress stalled, a paradox of paperwork and paralysis. Detectives rotated in and out, each bringing a new perspective, each convinced they might see what others had missed, only to find themselves staring at the same dead ends, the same unresolved contradictions. The victim's family learned the rhythms of waiting, the cadence of calls that brought no news, the careful wording of officials who had nothing new to share. Hope became something fragile, something rationed, because it believed too much hurt too deeply. Years slipped by, then decades, the case aging even as its impact refused to fade. And yet, beneath the dust and disappointment, the evidence remained silent but intact, a time capsule of crime frozen in the limitations of its era. It waited in boxes and envelopes, in refrigerated storage and locked cabinets, waiting for a future that no one in that small Virginia town could yet imagine, a future where answers might be coaxed from molecules too small to see, where the truth could be reconstructed from traces once thought meaningless. Back then, all anyone knew was that a life had been taken, a community had been shaken, and the person responsible had vanished into the ordinary flow of days, leaving behind a mystery that would refuse to die, a shadow stretching from 1986 onward, growing longer with every passing year. Time did not heal this town. It reorganized around absence. By winter, the woods where the body was found had returned to their quiet routines, snow smoothing over the scars left by boots and tape and questions. But the people did not forget. They carried the weight into grocery aisles and church pews, into the long pauses at stop signs where eyes met a little too long. Investigators kept working, though the work had changed shape, less frantic now, more procedural, the kind that relies on patience and faith in process. They replayed the timeline again and again, the last confirmed sighting, the gap where everything went dark, the discovery that shattered what little certainty remained. Each pass through the facts felt like walking a familiar road at night, knowing every turn and still bracing for what might jump out of shadows. The victim's final hours became a mosaic assembled from second-hand memories. Someone remembered her laugh at a local bar, bright and unguarded. Someone else recalled seeing her car turn down a road she rarely used. A clerk swore she'd been nervous when she paid for gas, hands trembling, eyes darting to the door. None of it aligned perfectly, but investigators pinned these fragments to corkboards anyway, hoping proximity might spark revelation. Photos faded slightly under fluorescent lights. Notes were rewritten, reorganized, color-coded. It looked like progress. It felt like control. But control is an illusion when the past refuses to cooperate. Suspects emerged, as they always do. A former boyfriend with a temper and a shaky alibi. A co-worker rumored to be obsessed. A drifter spotted near the woods that week, already gone by the time deputies came asking questions. Each name brought a surge of energy, a sense that the case was breathing again. Interviews were conducted in small rooms that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Voices recorded on tapes that would later hiss and warp with age. Some suspects cracked under pressure, contradicting themselves, revealing petty crimes and personal failures that made them look guilty even when they weren't. Others were calm, almost too calm, answering questions with rehearsed ease. Polygraph charts spiked and dipped, experts arguing over their meaning, while families watched from the outside, desperate for certainty, any certainty. For every theory that gained traction, another unraveled. The ex-boyfriend had been miles away, corroborated by witnesses who had no reason to lie. The co-worker's obsession turned out to be gossip, inflated by grief and fear. The drifter was tracked down, questioned, released his DNA, primitive testing at the time, offering nothing conclusive. Each elimination tightened the knot in investigators' chests. The suspect pool shrank, but clarity did not grow. Instead, a more unsettling possibility crept in, that the person responsible had never been on the list at all, that the truth was hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by normalcy. Pressure mounted from every direction. The family wanted answers. The community wanted reassurance. The department wanted resolution, not just for justice, but for morale. Cold cases cast long shadows over police work, reminders of limits no one likes to acknowledge. Detectives worked late, chasing hunches, revisiting old statements, calling witnesses who had long since tried forget. Some cooperated willingly, eager to help even years later. Others were hostile, resentful of being dragged back into a nightmare they believed was over. Memory had softened for many, details blurring, confidence replacing accuracy. The past, it turned out, was not a stable witness. As months bled into years, the case began to drift toward the margins. New crimes demanded attention, crimes with fresh evidence and living victims. Resources shifted. Files were moved from active desks to storage rooms, still accessible but no longer central. The lead detective retired, handing off the case with a mixture of apology and hope, convinced that someone else might see what he could not. The next detective felt the same way, and the next. Each brought a new energy, a brief renaissance of activity, before colliding with the same walls. It was as if the case itself resisted closure, absorbing effort and returning silence. The victim's family marked time differently. They measured years by anniversaries and court dates that never came, by birthdays that passed without celebration. They kept her room intact longer than anyone thought healthy, clinging to the illusion that she might still need it. They became experts in the language of law enforcement, reading between the lines of careful updates, learning to recognize when optimism was genuine and when it was performative. They collected newspaper clippings and television segments, building an archive of their own, a parallel record fueled by love and refusal. To let go felt like betrayal. In the wider community, the case slipped into legend. Teenagers who had been toddlers when it happened whispered about it at parties, retelling details with the exaggeration that distance allows. Parents used it as a cautionary tale, a reason to impose curfews and rules that had once seemed unnecessary. The woods gained a reputation, no longer just a place for hunting or hiking, but a site of unease where silence felt loaded. People swore they could feel it there, something unfinished, something watching. Rational minds dismissed it. But unease doesn't need logic to survive. Behind locked doors, the evidence waited. Boxes labeled in careful handwriting. Bags sealed with tape yellowing at the edges. A few hairs. A smear of blood. Fibers that might have come from clothing or upholstery or something else entirely. In 1986, these items have been frustratingly mute, offering possibilities without conclusions. Over time, forensic science leapt forward, methods refined, databases expanded, technologies imagined becoming real. Cases across the country were being reopened, solved decades after the fact, their answers wrung from evidence once thought exhausted. Hope stirred, cautiously, painfully, in those who still watched and waited. But reopening a case is not as simple as unlocking a door. It requires funding, justification, the right alignment of people willing to invest time in ghosts. For years, this case hovered just below that threshold, important but not urgent, tragic but familiar. It took a shift, a new perspective within the department, a recognition that old cases were not failures but opportunities deferred. When the boxes were finally pulled from storage, dust rising in the stale air, it felt almost ceremonial. The past was being invited back into the present, not as memory, but as evidence. The detective assigned to the review approached it differently. Younger. Trained in an era where technology was an ally rather than a promise, he saw potential where others had seen dead ends. He read every report, listened to every tape, not searching for a single missed clue, but for patterns, for inconsistencies that might have been invisible before. He noticed how certain names appeared and disappeared, how some statements had never been fully reconciled. He paid attention to what wasn't there, to gaps that suggested assumptions made too early, avenues never explored because they didn't fit the narrative forming at the time. Still, progress was slow. Evidence had degraded. Some items were unusable by modern standards. Witnesses had died, moved away, or lost the ability to recall with precision. The detective felt a familiar pull of frustration, the sense of pushing against something immovable. But there was also a quiet determination, fueled by the knowledge that time, once an enemy, might now be an asset. People change. Secrets age poorly. Technology does not forget. The decision was made to submit select evidence for advanced testing, a process that involved paperwork, approvals, and a weight that stretched nerves thin. The family was notified, cautiously, expectations managed. They had learned not to hope too loudly. When the call finally came, it wasn't the definitive answer everyone wanted, But it was something, a partial profile, incomplete but promising, a whisper where there had once been silence. It was enough to justify further work, enough to reopen doors that had been closed for decades. And somewhere, unknown and unbothered, the person responsible continued to live their life, shaped perhaps by the knowledge of what they had done, or perhaps untouched by it. The crime folded into their history like a sealed letter never opened. They could not know that the past was stirring, that molecules left behind in a moment of violence were now aligning, preparing to speak. In Virginia, the cold case that had refused to die was beginning to breathe again, not loudly, not yet, but with a steady, ominous rhythm that promised change, and with it, the possibility of a truth far more chilling than anyone had imagined. The first real crack did not come with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, buried in a lab report dense with technical language, the kind that doesn't shout but hums, low and persistent, until you realize it's changing everything. A partial genetic profile, extracted from evidence once dismissed as too compromised to matter, had stabilized enough to be compared against expanding databases. It wasn't a match, not yet, but it was a fingerprint of sorts, a biological signature that hadn't existed when the case was new. In 1986, this evidence had been a dead end. Now it was a door, barely open, light seeping through. The detective stared at the report longer than necessary, reading and rereading, letting its implications settle. Partial profiles were tricky, dangerous even, capable of misleading as much as illuminating. But they also carried promise. With the right approach, they could narrow a universe of suspects into something manageable. He began mapping possibilities, cross-referencing the profile with known offenders, unsolved cases, patterns of violence that stretched beyond county lines. The crime, once isolated, began to feel connected to something larger, a thread woven into a broader, darker fabric. Old assumptions were challenged. The original investigation had leaned heavily on the idea of familiarity, that the victim knew her killer, that the crime grew from proximity and emotion. It was a comforting theory, neat and explainable, but the evidence didn't insist on it. In fact, it resisted it. The partial profile suggested someone who had never been seriously considered, someone who hadn't been in her immediate circle, someone who slipped through the cracks because they didn't belong to any obvious category. The realization was unsettling. It meant the danger had been closer and more anonymous than anyone had believed. The detective returned to the crime scene in his mind, replaying it with fresh eyes. The location, once thought random, began to suggest deliberation. The way the body had been positioned, the absence of certain expected signs. Details that had been documented but not fully interrogated now took on weight. He wondered what had been missed not because of incompetence, but because of the limits of the era. Because investigators can only ask the questions their time allows them to imagine. He reached out to neighboring jurisdictions, requesting files on similar cases from the mid-1980s, particularly those involving victims with overlapping characteristics. Boxes arrived, some neatly archived, others a mess of photocopies and handwritten notes. Patterns emerged slowly, like images developing in a darkroom. A series of assaults. A homicide dismissed as unrelated. A suspect questioned once, then loss of time. None of it was conclusive, but together it suggested repetition, escalation, the possibility that Virginia's cold case was one chapter in a story no one had finished reading. Meanwhile, the family was told just enough to keep them steady. There was movement, they were assured. New testing, new avenues. The word sounded hopeful, but hope had become a dangerous thing, sharp at the edges. They learned to receive updates with measured gratitude, careful not to let anticipation bloom too fully. Still, they watched the phone more closely. They noticed when detectives stayed longer during visits, when their tone shifted from polite to focused. Something was happening. They could feel it. Back at the department, skepticism lingered. Cold cases have a way of inspiring both obsession and doubt, and not everyone believed this one would be different. Resources were finite. Leads were thin. But the detective persisted, driven by the sense that the case was finally responding, like a stubborn lock beginning to turn. He submitted the partial profile for genealogical analysis, a relatively new and controversial approach that promised breakthroughs at the cost of complexity and ethical debate. Approval took time. Arguments were made. Risks were weighed. In the end, permission was granted cautiously, with oversight and conditions. The waiting that followed was a special kind of torture. Weeks passed with no word, then months. The detective filled the time by revisiting interviews, listened to old tapes until voices from the past felt uncomfortably present. He caught things he hadn't before, a hesitation here, an over-explained detail there. Memory is performance. He reminded himself, shaped by fear and self-preservation. He began to suspect that someone, somewhere, had known more than they said, not necessarily the killer, but someone adjacent to the truth, someone who had chosen silence because it was easier than involvement. When the genealogical report finally arrived, it did not deliver a name. It delivered a direction. A family tree sprawling across decades, branches thick with possibility, distant relatives, shared markers. The work ahead would be painstaking, requiring the narrowing of lines through age, geography, opportunity. It was less like solving a puzzle and more like excavation, brushing away layers of history in hopes of uncovering something intact beneath. The detective felt the weight of it, the responsibility. Each wrong turn could waste months. Each assumption could derail everything. As he traced the tree, one branch began to stand out, not because it screamed guilt, but because it whispered relevance. A man who had lived in the area in the mid-1980s. No criminal record at the time. A job that took him across county lines. Later arrests for offenses that suggested capacity for violence, though nothing tied directly to murder. He had moved often, leaving behind addresses like breadcrumbs. The detective pinned his photo to the board, not as an accusation, but as a question. Revisiting this individual's history meant reopening old wounds for others. Former co-workers were contacted. Neighbors tracked down. Some barely remembered him. Others remembered too much. Stories resurfacing that had never felt important enough to report. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He had a temper when pushed. None of it proved anything. All of it mattered. The detective felt a familiar tension between circumstantial buildup and the need for something solid, something undeniable. The suspect, if that's what he was older now, his life shaped by years no one had scrutinized. He had a family, a routine, a sense of normalcy that clung to him like armor. Approaching him would require care. One wrong move could spook him, shut down cooperation, send him reaching for a lawyer before a single useful word was spoken. The detective planned meticulously, coordinating with prosecutors, mapping out questions designed not to accuse, but to invite explanation. As the pieces aligned, the case's gravity deepened. This was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about confronting the idea that someone could live for decades alongside others, carrying a secret that violent, that final, without consequence. It was about the failure of systems and the persistence of truth. Somewhere between the past and the present, the two were converging. And when they met, the collision would be impossible to ignore. The decision to make contact was delayed not by fear, but by strategy. In cold cases, timing is a weapon. Too early and you alert the subject. Give them time to rehearse, to build walls. Too late, and you risk losing momentum, the fragile thread of attention that keeps the past from slipping back into silence. The detective waited, studying the suspect's routines through paper trails and quiet inquiries. He learned when the man woke, where he worked, the routes he drove without thinking. Ordinary patterns, unremarkable on their own, yet heavy with implication when seen through the lens of what might have happened decades earlier. The first knock was not dramatic. No flashing lights. No uniforms crowding the doorway. Just a man with a badge held low, a calm voice, a request for a few minutes of conversation. The suspect answered in a t-shirt and worn jeans, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something practiced and neutral. He listened. He nodded. He agreed to talk. There was nothing in that moment that resembled guilt or innocence, only the careful management of appearances. Inside the house, time seemed layered. Family photos lined the walls, smiling faces frozen in years far removed from 1986. The detective noted them without comment, aware of the psychological weight they carried. This was a life built after the crime, a narrative the suspect likely told himself as much as anyone else. The conversation began with the mundane, questions about work history, moves between states, memories of living in Virginia in the mid-'80s. The suspect answered easily, almost eagerly, as if pleased to demonstrate cooperation. But cracks don't appear under pressure. They appear under repetition. The detective circled back to certain details, rephrased questions, shifted timelines slightly. Each time, he watched the man's face, the subtle tightening around the eyes, the pause before correcting himself. Nothing overt, nothing a defense attorney couldn't explain away. Yet the rhythm was off, like a song played just a beat too slow. The detective felt it, the sense that beneath the surface, calculations were being made. When the conversation ended, no accusations were made, no demands issued. The detective thanked him for his time and left, carrying with him pages of notes and a growing conviction that the truth was close enough to cast a shadow. Surveillance followed, discreet and limited. Phone records were subpoenaed, financial histories reviewed. The past, once diffuse and scattered, began to organize itself around this single figure. Meanwhile, the lab work continued. Investigators sought a direct DNA sample, something that could move the case from suspicion to certainty. But obtaining it legally required finesse. The suspect was careful, disposing of trash at odd times, avoiding obvious opportunities. Then chance intervened, as it often does in cases that stretch this long. A discarded coffee cup at a public park, a napkin left behind at a fast food counter, items collected quietly, without confrontation, sent off for analysis. The waiting returned, heavier now because the stakes were clearer. Each day stretched with the knowledge that a result, one way or another, was coming. The detective replayed the interview in his mind, scrutinizing every answer. He questioned himself, too. Was he projecting? Had years of cold case frustration sharpened his instincts or dulled his objectivity? Doubt is a necessary companion in this work, a safeguard against certainty that comes too easily. When the call finally came, it was brief, professional, controlled. The sample was a match. Not partial, not suggestive, a direct correspondence that collapsed decades into a single, undeniable point. The detective closed his eyes as he listened, feeling not triumph, but gravity. This was the moment families imagine, investigators chase, and suspects dread. The truth had surfaced, cold and unyielding. An arrest warrant prepared with care, every step documented, every procedure followed to the letter. There would be no mistakes now. The suspect was taken into custody without incident, his expression unreadable as handcuffs clicked into place. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, the sudden intrusion of police vehicles turning an ordinary afternoon into something else entirely. The past had arrived unannounced, demanding attention. Interrogation began in a room designed to be unremarkable, stripped of distractions. The suspect sat across from the detective, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the table. The approach was different this time. No small talk, no gentle probing. The evidence was laid out methodically, each piece placed with intention. The DNA, the timeline, the inconsistencies. The suspect listened, jaw tightening, silence stretching between words. Denial came first, predictable and thin. Claims of coincidence, suggestions of contamination. The detective let them hang, unanswered. He knew the power of letting a story collapse under its own weight. As hours passed, the suspect's composure eroded. He asked for water. He rubbed his temples. He stared at the wall as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. The detective spoke again, not accusing, but inviting, framing confession as an explanation rather than an admission of monstrosity. The break, when it came, was not cinematic. No sudden outburst. No tears. Just a shift, a sigh heavy with years of containment. The suspect began to talk, his voice low, almost attached, recounting events with a precision that betrayed long rehearsal. He described the night in fragments, sensory details slipping through despite attempts to control them. A smell, a sound, the moment things went too far. Listening. The detective felt the room shrink, the past pressing in with suffocating clarity. The confession did not absolve. It complicated. It introduced motives that were banal and disturbing in equal measure, rooted in impulse rather than planning, opportunity rather than obsession. The suspect framed himself as a man overtaken by circumstance, a narrative that clashed violently with the reality of a life lost and a family shattered. The detective did not argue. He recorded. He preserved the words exactly as they were spoken, knowing they would echo far beyond this room. News of the arrest spread quickly once it was official. Headlines followed, each one a blunt instrument attempting to compress decades into a few lines of text. The community reacted with shock, then with questions. How had he gone unnoticed? How many times had they crossed paths? The idea that the killer had lived among them. Unremarkable and unchallenged, unsettled even those with no direct connection to the case. For the family, the call came with a weight that words could not carry. They listened as the detective explained, his voice steady, careful. There was relief, yes, but it was tangled with grief, anger, and the strange hollowness that follows the end of a long search. Justice, when delayed this long, arrives altered, its edges worn by time. They asked questions. They cried. They sat in silence, absorbing the reality that the mystery that had defined so much of their lives was no longer a mystery at all. As the suspect was processed, photographed, reduced to identifiers and charges, the detective stepped back, allowing others to take over. His role, the pursuit, was complete, yet the case did not feel finished. It never does. Solving a cold case is less like closing a door and more like opening a window, letting in air that reveals everything the room has held on to for years. The truth was out now, exposed and irreversible, and its presence would linger long after the headlines faded. The courtroom did not feel like a place of resolution. It felt like a container, built to hold truths too volatile to exist anywhere else. With paneling fluorescent lights, rows of benches worn smooth by decades of shifting bodies. The suspect entered in cuffs, flanked by deputies whose faces betrayed nothing. The room inhaled as one, a collective breath drawn tight with expectation. This was the moment people imagine when they think of justice finally arriving. But imagination rarely prepares you for the stillness that follows. The arraignment was procedural, almost mechanical. Charges read aloud in a measured voice. Date set, rights explained. Words that carried immense weight delivered with deliberate neutrality. The suspect stood motionless, eyes forward, absorbing the language of consequence. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not search for familiar faces. Whatever internal reckoning he was having remained sealed behind an expression carefully assembled over decades. For the family, being in the same room felt unreal. This was the first time proximity had replaced abstraction. The person responsible for the loss they had carried like a second spine was now tangible, bound by rules and ritual. Some expected a surge of emotion, rage, collapse, release, but what arrived instead was a sharp, clarifying focus. Every sound was louder, every movement exaggerated. Time slowed, not out of mercy, but scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, microphones clustered like steel flowers. Reporters rehearsed questions, shaping narratives in advance. Cold case solved. Breakthrough technology. Decades later. The language was familiar, efficient, and insufficient. None of it captured the way the air inside the courtroom had felt. Thick with history and restraint. None of it translated the private exchanges of glances, the subtle shifts in posture that told a deeper story. As the legal process advanced, evidence was prepared for public consumption. Photographs once buried in files resurfaced, their edges softened by age, but their impact unchanged. Diagrams were redrawn, timelines reconstructed with forensic precision. The confession was transcribed, every pause preserved, every inflection flattened into text. The past was being reassembled piece by piece, not as memory, but as argument. Defense motions followed, predictable and necessary. Challenges to procedure, questions about chain of custody, the reliability of new technology applied to old evidence. None of it surprising. The system demanded friction, and friction demanded patience. The family learned quickly that resolution was not a straight line. It was a series of controlled delays, each one reopening wounds under the guise of fairness. The suspect's demeanor shifted subtly over time. In initial hearings, he appeared guarded, almost attached. As weeks passed, that detachment cracked, replaced by flashes of irritation, fatigue, something like fear. He whispered frequently to his attorney, fingers tapping the table in restless patterns. The weight of permanence began to press in, eroding the illusion that this was a temporary interruption rather than the end of a long evasion. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to work, not because they doubted the outcome, but because thoroughness was the final obligation. They revisited peripheral leads, confirmed alibis long dismissed, ensured there were no unanswered questions that could later undermine the case. Cold cases, once reopened, invite scrutiny from every angle. Every assumption is tested. Every conclusion must withstand the pressure of time turned backward. Experts were called to explain the science. They spoke calmly about degradation rates, statistical certainty, methodologies refined over decades. Their testimony was precise, technical, unyielding. This was not magic. It was accumulation, progress layered upon persistence. The idea that technology had solved the case alone was a convenient myth. In truth, it had only illuminated what human effort had preserved long enough to be seen. As trial approached, the community's interest intensified. People who had been children in 1986 now followed updates online, piecing together memories they hadn't known were incomplete. Conversations resurfaced in grocery store aisles, in parking lots, in quiet corners of local bars. The case had become a mirror, reflecting how much time had passed and how deeply it had shaped the collective subconscious. The family prepared in their own way. Some avoided the news entirely, choosing to encounter the process only when required. Others read every article, watched every briefing, searching for details that might offer understanding, if not comfort. There was no correct approach. Grief does not standardize itself for public proceedings. When the trial began, it did so without spectacle. Jurors filed in, ordinary people tasked with absorbing extraordinary responsibility. Opening statements laid out competing narratives. The prosecution spoke of evidence, opportunity, confession. The defense spoke of doubt, memory, the danger of hindsight. Both sides appealed to reason, but only one had the benefit of truth anchored by proof. Witnesses took the stand, voices steady or trembling, depending on the weight of their connection. Former investigators described the early days, the limitations they faced, the decisions that had haunted them. Forensic analysts explained processes in language designed to bridge the gap between lab and jury box. Each testimony added density to the story, making it harder to ignore, harder to distort. When the confession was introduced, the room changed. Hearing the words spoken aloud, stripped of tone and context, was jarring. The suspect sat motionless as his own past replayed through another voice. The family listened, bracing themselves against each sentence. This was not closure. This was confrontation. The defense attempted to reframe confession, suggesting coercion, exhaustion, misunderstanding. But the recording told its own story. The pauses were voluntary, the details unsolicited. The narrative unfolded without prompting. It was not the confession of a man cornered into compliance, but of someone who had carried the story too long and could no longer contain it. As days passed, the trial narrowed, arguments sharpened, the edges of the case grew cleaner. When closing statements arrived, they did not feel like persuasion so much as confirmation. The jury withdrew, carrying with them decades of silence and a mandate to speak for it. The wait for a verdict was brief. When the jury returned, the room held its breath again, that same collective inhale from the arraignment now tinged with inevitability. The foreperson stood, voice steady, and read the words that would anchor the case permanently in history. Guilty. The reaction was subdued. No gasps, no cheers, just a quiet release, like tension draining from a space that had been braced for impact for years. The suspect showed little response, his expression finally empty, the performance no longer necessary. The family closed their eyes, some gripping hands, others pressing palms flat against the bench as if to steady themselves. Sentencing would come later. The legal process would continue its careful march. But something fundamental had shifted. The case was no longer unresolved. The question mark that had hovered over the community for nearly 4 decades had been replaced with a period. Outside, cameras captured faces emerging into daylight. Reporters spoke of justice served, of answers finally delivered. But inside, in the quieter spaces where the story truly lived, the feeling was more complex. Relief braided with sorrow. Vindication shadowed by loss. The truth had been revealed, chilling in its clarity, and now it demanded to be lived with. The cold case was solved, but its temperature did not rise. It remained cold because it had always been cold, because time does not warm what was taken, only what was hidden. And now, with nothing left to hide, the truth settled into its final form, heavy, unchangeable, and impossible to ignore. After the verdict, silence became a different kind of noise. It followed the family home, settled into hallways, lingered at kitchen tables where the case had once been discussed in hushed tones and coded phrases. For years, their lives have been structured around not knowing, around the absence of answers shaping every decision, every holiday, every quiet moment before sleep. Now the answers existed, fixed and immutable, and the question became how to live alongside them. Sentencing arrived without drama, as most consequential moments do. The judge spoke of responsibility, of the gravity of the crime, of the irreversible damage done. The language was formal, restrained, yet each word carried a weight that pressed down on the room. The sentence was delivered clearly, without flourish, and with it came a sense of finality that felt both earned and insufficient. Years in prison could not balance decades of loss. It could only acknowledge them. The suspect was led away, no longer a suspect at all, but convicted man. His identity reduced to case numbers and correctional protocols. There was no final glance, no attempt at connection. Whatever internal narrative had sustained him through years of anonymity had collapsed, replaced by a future defined entirely by confinement. For the first time, he belonged fully to the system he had once evaded. In the days that followed, the community began to recalibrate. The case, once a source of speculation and unease, shifted into something else. An example, a cautionary tale, a reminder that time does not erase violence. It only buries until it surfaces again. Conversations changed tone. Where there had been questions, there were now statements. Where there had been rumors, there was record. Memorials took on new meaning. The victim's name, long spoken with uncertainty, was now anchored to truth. Vigils were held not as pleas for answers, but as acknowledgments of endurance. People spoke of resilience, of patience, of the strange justice that arrives late, but arrives nonetheless. The family stood among them, present but distant, absorbing words that could never quite reach where the pain lived. For investigators, the case entered a different phase of memory. Files were archived, evidence returned to storage, reports finalized, yet the emotional residue lingered. Solving a cold case does not bring relief so much as perspective. It sharpens awareness of all the cases that remain unsolved, all the families still waiting. The victory was real, but it was not complete. The lead detective found himself revisiting the early days of the investigation in his thoughts, replaying decisions made by people long retired or gone. He wondered how close they had been, how often the truth had passed within reach unnoticed. This was not regret exactly, but a reckoning with the limitations of time and technology, with the reality that justice is often contingent on factors beyond human control. Media attention faded gradually, as it always does. Headlines gave way to newer stories, fresher tragedies. The case became a reference point rather than a focus, cited in discussions of forensic advancement and perseverance. Its details were summarized, condensed, stripped of texture. What remained was the outline, the arc, the reassurance that resolution is possible. But for those at the center, resolution did not mean erasure. The past did not recede simply because it had been explained. Memories resurfaced with new context, old moments reframed by knowledge. The family found themselves grieving again, this time with clarity. The wound, once undefined, now at edges, and edges can hurt in ways vagueness cannot. There were moments of anger, unexpected and sharp. Anger at the years lost, at the ordinary life the perpetrator had lived while they remained suspended in uncertainty. Anger at the randomness of it all, the fragile chain of events that had allowed the truth to remain hidden for so long. These emotions arrived without warning, demanding space and acknowledgement. Healing, when it came, was subtle. It appeared in small decisions, in the willingness to plan for a future not overshadowed by investigation updates and anniversaries marked by frustration. It emerged in conversations that no longer circled endlessly around the same unanswered questions. It was not a return to normal, but the creation of something new, shaped by endurance rather than absence. The case also left its mark on policy. Departments reviewed evidence storage procedures, reconsidered what should be preserved and how. Training sessions referenced the investigation, emphasizing the importance of diligence even when leads run dry. The idea that no case is truly cold, only waiting, gained renewed traction. The past, it seemed, had something to teach the present. As months turned into a year, the story settled into its final shape. Not a mystery, not a headline, but a chapter in the long, uneven history of accountability. The chilling truth revealed by new technology had done more than identify a killer. It had demonstrated the persistence of evidence, the patience of those who refuse to forget, and the uneasy reality that time can be both an obstacle and an ally. The night the detective closed the case file for the last time, he did so without ceremony. No speech, no gesture, just a quiet act of placing it among others, knowing this one would stand apart, not because it was perfect, but because it endured, because it waited, because it proved that even after decades of silence, the truth can still find its voice. And in that voice, steady and unforgiving, the past finally spoke, not to accuse or haunt, but to be known. Time did not rush in to fill the space left behind. It seeped, slowly, unevenly. The days after the case closed felt strangely hollow, as if the gravity that held everything in orbit for decades had suddenly vanished, leaving people unanchored. For so long, the mystery had been a constant presence, an unspoken companion to daily life. Without it, mornings arrived quieter, evenings stretched longer, and the absence of anticipation felt almost disorienting. The family discovered that certainty carries its own weight. Knowing exactly how and why the loss occurred did not simplify grief. It reorganized it. Memories that had once floated free now snapped into alignment, moments in the past suddenly illuminated by context they had never had before. A phone call that once seemed ordinary, a delay that now felt significant, a look remembered too clearly. The truth rewrote the past in ways no one had anticipated. There were nights when sleep came easily, and nights when it refused entirely. The mind, relieved of its questions, turned instead to images, not imagined possibilities anymore, but confirmed realities. These were harder in some ways. Possibility allows hope. Certainty demands acceptance, and acceptance is work. In the community, the case continued to ripple outward, affecting people who had not realized how closely they were connected. Former classmates, neighbors, co-workers from long-ago jobs came forward with stories they had never shared, not because they were crucial, but because they finally made sense to them. The truth had unlocked memory, and memory, once unlocked, wanted to be heard. Some spoke with guilt, wondering if they should have noticed something, said something, pushed harder. Others expressed relief, grateful that the lingering unease they had carried without naming it now had a source and an end. The case had functioned like a low-frequency hum for decades, barely audible but always present. Now that it had stopped, people noticed the quiet. The convicted man became a topic of curiosity for a brief time, then gradually faded into abstraction. There were no interviews, no attempts to explain or justify. His story, once hidden, was now closed, contained within court records and institutional routines. Whatever complexity lay behind his actions remained largely inaccessible, and for most, that was enough. Understanding motive was no longer necessary. Accountability had replaced speculation. Investigators who had worked the case felt an unexpected sense of dislocation. Their professional identities had been shaped by pursuit, by the discipline of not giving up even when progress was invisible. With the case resolved, they were forced to confront the quieter aspect of the job, the unresolved files still waiting, the knowledge that resolution is the exception, not the rule. The lead detective found himself less eager to speak about the case than others expected. When asked, he offered facts, timelines, outcomes, but avoided interpretation. He understood now that the story no longer belonged to him or to the department. It belonged to those who had lived inside its uncertainty. His role had been to listen, to preserve, to wait. The rest was not his to define. There were moments when a family considered leaving the town altogether, starting fresh, somewhere unburdened by memory. But in the end, most stayed. The place that held their pain also held their history, their resilience, their refusal to forget. Leaving felt less like escape, and more like erasure. Staying became an act of quiet defiance. Anniversaries came and went with less ceremony than before. The dates still mattered, but they no longer demanded vigilance. Candles were lit without the ache of unanswered questions. Names were spoken without hesitation. The rituals changed, softened, made room for reflection rather than protest. The case also altered how people spoke about time. Before, it had been an enemy, something that stole evidence, blurred memories, protected the guilty. Now it was seen differently. Time had preserved what mattered most. It had allowed technology to catch up. It had outlasted deception. The years had not been kind, but they had been patient. Late one evening, the detective walked past courthouse, its lights dimmed, its windows reflecting nothing but the street. He paused, not out of nostalgia, but recognition. The building had held a truth long enough for it to be spoken. That, he realized, was its quiet power. Not judgment, but endurance. The story no longer demanded attention. It did not intrude. It existed, complete and settled, like a scar that no longer aches but never disappears. And in that permanence was something close to peace. Not relief, not happiness, but steadiness that had been impossible before. The cold case had finally warmed enough to release its grip, not by being forgotten, but by being fully known. And in the space it left behind, life, unremarkable and resilient, began again. What followed was not a return to normal, because normal had never existed in the shadow of the case. What followed was recalibration, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in how people carried themselves to the world, as if an internal weight had been redistributed. The absence of mystery did not create lightness. It created balance. In quiet moments, the family noticed how often they no longer reached for old habits. No checking news alerts late at night. No bracing themselves before unfamiliar phone calls. No instinctive tightening when a police car slowed near the house. These reflexes had once been survival mechanisms, rehearsed over decades. Letting them go felt unnatural, like relaxing a muscle that had never known rest. Grief changed its shape again. It no longer surged in response to stalled investigations or false hope. Instead, it settled into something steadier, more predictable. There were still waves, but they came with warning. Memory became less of an ambush and more of a companion, walking quietly alongside daily life rather than colliding with it. The victim's name began appearing in different contexts, not just in crime reporting or legal records, but in scholarship funds, in community initiatives, in small acts of remembrance that were forward-looking rather than anchored in tragedy. The name stopped being shorthand for loss and became a marker of continuity, something taken, yes, but also something that endured. Investigators watched this transformation from a distance. They understood better than anyone that closure is not an endpoint but a turning. They had seen families fracture after resolutions, seen others find unexpected strength. This case fell somewhere in between, defined not by dramatic recovery, but by quiet persistence. It reminded them that solving a case does not solve a life. The technology that had cracked the truth became a subject of fascination, then normalization. DNA analysis, once groundbreaking, was already evolving into something even more precise. The idea that justice could be delayed but not denied gained traction, though those closest to the case knew better than to romanticize it. Delay extracts its own penalties. It taxes bodies, minds, relationships. Technology may uncover truth, but it cannot give back time. Within law enforcement, the case prompted introspection. Detectives reviewed unsolved files with renewed urgency, asking not just what was missing, but what might still be waiting. Evidence once dismissed as inconclusive was reevaluated. Storage rooms were reorganized. Databases updated. The past was not rewritten, but it was re-examined. The lead detective began mentoring younger officers differently. He emphasized patience over bravado, listening over assumption. He spoke of silence as data, of absence as information. He taught them that cold cases are not frozen in time, but suspended, responsive to persistence and humility. The lesson was not about solving everything. It was about honoring what remains unsolved. In the wider world, the case faded as expected. Public attention shifted. New crimes, new mysteries, new urgencies demanded space. But occasionally, Someone would stumble across the story years later, reading it without the lived context, and feel a sudden chill, not because of the violence itself, but because of the years it took to name it. That delayed recognition lingered in imagination. For the family, the future slowly opened in small ways. Plans once postponed indefinitely were reconsidered. Travel, moves, changes that had seemed impossible when life revolved around waiting. None of these decisions felt like betrayals of the past. They felt like acknowledgments that life, though altered, was still theirs to shape. There were moments of unexpected gratitude. Gratitude for investigators who refused to forget, for strangers who had cared quietly, for the endurance that had carried them through years when hope felt irresponsible. These feelings did not erase anger or sadness, but they coexisted, making the emotional landscape more complex, more human. At night, when the house was still, the absence of uncertainty was most noticeable. Silence no longer felt like a threat. It felt neutral. The kind of silence that allows thought rather than demanding defense. Sleep came more easily, not every night, but often enough to matter. The case, once an open wound, had become a scar, visible, permanent, but no longer raw. It marked a history that could not be undone, but also one that no longer defined every breath. The truth had not healed everything, but it had stabilized what had once been endlessly shifting. And somewhere beneath all of it, steady and unyielding, was a knowledge that waiting had finally ended, not with celebration, not with relief, but with the quiet understanding that the story, once fractured by doubt, was now whole. With distance came perspective, and with perspective, a new kind of unease. The case was solved, yes, but its implications stretched far beyond a single verdict or a single family. It forced uncomfortable questions into the open about how many other truths lay dormant, about how often justice waits for circumstance rather than action, about the cost of forgetting even when forgetting feels inevitable. The community began to talk differently about the past. Stories once told with speculation were retold with precision. Language sharpened. Rumor lost its power. What had once been an unresolved narrative transformed into a documented history. That shift mattered. It changed how people trusted memory, how they spoke about responsibility, how they taught their children about what had happened, and why it could not be allowed to fade into abstraction. There were public forums, small and understated, where law enforcement and residents discussed the case in measured tones. These were not confessions or celebrations. They were acknowledgments of mistakes made, of limitations faced, of persistence rewarded. The atmosphere was sober, reflective, grounded in the understanding that progress rarely arrives cleanly. One recurring theme emerged: the danger of assumptions. Early theories had felt convincing. Certain individuals had drawn scrutiny simply because they fit a narrative that made sense at the time. The true perpetrator had moved through life unnoticed, shielded by normalcy and the absence of suspicion. This realization unsettled people. It challenged the comfort of believing that evil announces itself clearly. For investigators, this lesson reinforced a discipline already hard-earned: the need to question intuition, to revisit conclusions, to allow doubt to coexist with experience. The case became an internal reference point, a reminder that certainty is fragile and humility is a tool, not a weakness. The family, meanwhile, navigated a subtle shift in how others treated them. Sympathy gave way to respect. Pity receded, replaced by recognition of endurance. Conversations were no longer cautious or apologetic. People spoke openly, directly, without fear of reopening wounds. The wounds, it turned out, were no longer as fragile as assumed. In private moments, the family reflected on how the case had shaped their identities. Careers chosen, relationships strained or strengthened, decisions made with the weight of unresolved loss pressing down. Now, with that weight altered, they found themselves renegotiating who they were without it. This was not easy. The mystery had been a constant companion, shaping their sense of purpose. Letting it go felt like stepping into unfamiliar terrain. There were moments of doubt. What if the truth had come too late to matter? What if the years of waiting had extracted too high a cost? These questions had no clear answers. They lingered, not as accusations, but as reminders that justice, even when achieved, arrives imperfectly. The convicted man remained silent, his presence confined institutional updates and legal records. No further revelations came. No dramatic confessions. The absence of narrative from his side left a void that some found unsettling. But over time, that void lost its pull. The story no longer needed his voice to feel complete. Accountability had been established. Explanation was secondary. As seasons passed, the physical spaces connected to the case changed. Buildings were renovated, streets repaved, landmarks altered or removed. Yet certain places retained their emotional resonance. A stretch of road, a patch of woods, a building corner where nothing visible marked its significance, but everything invisible did. These places held memory not because they tried to, but because people carried it with them. The detective returned to one such location alone one afternoon. There was no official reason, no investigative purpose. Just a need to stand where the past had once been unknowable. He observed the ordinary life moving through the space now, cars passing, people walking, the world unremarkable and indifferent. The contrast was striking. The violence that had occurred there had not altered the future of the place. It had altered the people who knew. This realization stayed with him. That crimes do not scar landscapes the way they scar lives. That the world continues, often oblivious, while individuals carry histories that shape every step. Solving the case had not changed that fundamental truth. It had only made it visible. The story, once defined by absence, was now defined by consequence. Not just the consequence faced by the perpetrator, but the consequences absorbed by everyone else. These consequences did not fade with resolution. They integrated, becoming part of the fabric of memory. And in that integration, something enduring took root, not closure, but understanding. Not peace, but clarity. The kind of clarity that does not soothe, but steadies. That allows life to move forward without pretending the past never happened. The cold case, though solved, continued to speak. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, reminding anyone who listened that truth, once uncovered, does not end a story. It transforms it. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but inside the people touched by the case, something fundamental had shifted. The urgency that once drove every conversation, every decision, had dissolved, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. Life no longer revolved around waiting for answers. It revolved around learning how to live with them. The family noticed how silence behaved differently now. Before, silence had been an accusation, a reminder of what was missing, what had not yet been said. Now it was simply space. Space to think. Space to remember without panic. Space to breathe without bracing for disappointment. This change did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. An afternoon that passed without tension, a conversation that ended without drifting back to the case, a laugh that felt unburdened. Memory began reorganizing itself. Moments once overshadowed by the unresolved mystery resurfaced with new clarity. Childhood events, holidays, small, ordinary joys had been dulled by uncertainty. These memories returned altered, no longer competing with unanswered questions. They reclaimed their original shapes, reminding the family that their lives had always been larger than the crime that had interrupted them. There was also anger, sharper now that it no longer had a target in uncertainty. Anger at the years lost, at opportunities deferred, at the version of life that might have been possible if the truth had come sooner. This anger was not explosive. It was precise, controlled, and exhausting. It demanded acknowledgement before it could recede. Investigators encountered similar emotions. Solving the case brought satisfaction, but also regret. Regret for early assumptions that had narrowed focus, for evidence that had once seemed insignificant, for tools that had not yet existed. These reflections were not public confessions. They were internal reckonings, shaping how future cases would be approached, how patience and skepticism would be balanced. The case quietly entered training discussions, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale. It illustrated the danger of certainty, the importance of preservation, the value of restraint. Young investigators listened carefully, absorbing lessons that could not be taught through procedure alone. The story became institutional memory, passed down not with pride, but with respect. Outside law enforcement, the public narrative simplified, as it always does. Headlines condensed decades into sentences. The complexity flattened. But for those who had lived through the waiting, the simplification felt distant, almost irrelevant. Their understanding of the case was layered, textured, resistant to summary. It could not be reduced without losing its meaning. The family learned to navigate questions from strangers, well-intentioned, curious, sometimes intrusive. They developed a shared instinct for when to answer and when to deflect, not out of secrecy, but out of self-preservation. The story belonged to them, but it did not belong to everyone equally. Over time, the case stopped being the first thing people associated with them. Introductions changed. Conversations opened with present realities rather than past tragedy. This shift was both welcome and disorienting. Identity, once forged in endurance, began to soften, making room for other definitions. There were still reminders, court documents, archive footage, the occasional resurfacing of the story online. Each one carried less sting than before, but none were neutral. The past, even clarified, never becomes inert. It remains reactive, capable of stirring emotion without warning. Late at night, when reflection felt unavoidable, the family confronted a final, unsettling truth. Resolution did not restore innocence. The world remained unpredictable. Safety remained conditional. Trust remained fragile. Solving the case had not rebuilt the illusion of control. It had dismantled it permanently. And yet, within that dismantling, there was strength, a grounded awareness, an ability to face uncertainty without denial. They had lived with not knowing for decades. Knowing, now, did not frighten them the way it once might have. The case had taken years, but it had also given something back. Not answers alone, but resilience sharpened by endurance. A resilience that did not erase pain, but absorbed it, carried it forward, and refused to let it define the future entirely. The story continued, not as a mystery, but as a lived experience, complex, unresolved in its own way, and deeply human. Time did not stop asking questions just because the case had been solved. It asked them differently now, with less urgency but more depth, as if probing beneath the surface for what had truly changed. The answers were not dramatic. They arrived quietly, folded into routine, revealed in moments that felt ordinary until they weren't. The family began to notice how often they spoke in the present tense. Plans extended beyond the next court date, the next update, the next possibility of disappointment. Conversations drifted toward futures that had once felt hypothetical. There was hesitation at first, an almost superstitious fear of imagining too much. Hope had once been dangerous. Letting it back and required trust in a reality that had proven unreliable. Grief resurfaced in unexpected forms. Not the sharp grief of uncertainty, but a deeper, more reflective sorrow. The kind that mourns not just a life lost, but the version of oneself that lived in anticipation of answers. That version had been alert, vigilant, perpetually unfinished. Letting it go felt like losing something familiar, even if it had been painful. The truth had closed one door but opened another, an internal reckoning with what it meant to move forward, without a singular purpose anchoring every day. For years, the case had provided direction. Even in its silence, it had dictated priorities. Now, without it, there was a void that needed to be filled not urgently, but thoughtfully. Investigators experienced something similar. The case no longer demanded attention, but its absence left space for reflection. Files were archived, but memories lingered. The hours spent reviewing evidence, the dead ends, the late nights chasing improbable leads. All of it remained vivid. Closure did not erase the labor. It highlighted it. One investigator admitted, privately, that the case had altered his understanding of success. It was not about speed or recognition. It was about persistence without guarantee, about staying engaged when progress was invisible. That lesson carried forward, shaping how he approached every unresolved file that followed. In the community, the case began to settle into local history, not mythologized, not sensationalized, but remembered with clarity. Schools referenced it cautiously, emphasizing lessons rather than details. It became an example of why patience matters, why evidence must be preserved, why assumptions can be costly. The physical artifacts of the investigation, Photographs, reports, recordings were stored away, but they retained their weight. Objects once charged with urgency now existed as documentation. Their power diminished, but did not disappear. They were reminders of how fragile truth can be when time intervenes. The family chose to reclaim certain spaces that had once felt contaminated by association. Places avoided for years were revisited deliberately, not to confront trauma, but to neutralize it, to prove that meaning could be rewritten, that geography did not have to remain hostage to memory. There were moments of unexpected peace, not happiness in the conventional sense, but steadiness, a sense that life no longer hovered on the brink of revelation. This steadiness allowed emotions to surface naturally without being filtered through anticipation. It was unfamiliar, but welcome. Still, questions lingered, not about who or how, but about why. Motive, context, the internal logic of violence. These questions resisted resolution. They hovered at the edges of understanding, unsatisfied by facts alone. Accepting that some answers will remain inaccessible became part of the healing. The convicted individual faded from focus. His identity, once central, receded into irrelevance. The story no longer revolved around him. It revolved around the impact left behind, the lives reshaped by absence and waiting. In that shift, the narrative reclaimed its humanity. As months passed, the case's emotional gravity lessened, but its significance did not. It remained a reference point, a quiet reminder of endurance, not something to dwell on, but something to acknowledge, a chapter closed but not erased. The truth had arrived late, but it had arrived fully. And in its wake, life continued, not restored, not redeemed, but recalibrated. The recalibration did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly, in habits rewritten and reactions softened, in the gradual erosion of vigilance that had once felt essential. For years, every phone call had carried potential meaning. Every unexpected knock had suggested consequence. Now, the world moved with less menace, and that absence of threat felt almost foreign. The family discovered how deeply anticipation had shaped their nervous systems. Even ordinary events, a delay, a missed message, once triggered a cascade of worry tied to the case. With resolution behind them, those reflexes began to loosen, not disappear. Loosen. The body, long accustomed to bracing for news, slowly learned a different posture. They spoke less about the case among themselves, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer demanded rehearsal. The story was complete enough to rest. When it surfaced, it did so organically, woven into conversations about memory, justice, or time. It was no longer the axis around which everything turned. There were still moments of disbelief. The mind, trained for decades to expect incompletion, sometimes resisted finality, a document confirming the conviction, a public record updated. Each one reinforced what logic accepted but emotion still tested. Closure, it turned out, was not a switch. It was a condition that required reinforcement. Investigators observed the same phenomenon from a distance. Even with the case resolved, they found themselves revisiting its details, not out of doubt, but habit. Years of scrutiny had created grooves in thought that did not vanish easily. Yet each revisit felt different now, less tense, more analytical, stripped of urgency. The case influenced how cold cases were discussed within departments. It validated patience. It justified restraint. It reminded leadership that preservation, not pressure, often determines outcomes. Funding decisions shifted subtly. Policies adjusted, not because of one case alone, but because it embodied principles that had long been understood, but rarely proven so decisively. In the broader public sphere, attention moved on, as it always does. New stories emerged. New crises demanded focus. The solved case slipped from headlines into archives. For the family, this fading felt appropriate. Justice had never been about spectacle. It had been about acknowledgement. They marked the passage of time differently now. Anniversaries no longer felt like countdowns or reminders of failure. They became moments of reflection, measured not by what was missing, but by what had been endured. The weight of those dates shifted. They still mattered, but they no longer dominated. One family member described it as learning to carry a scar rather than an open wound. The injury remained visible, meaningful, instructive, but it no longer dictated movement. Life adapted around it, compensating, strengthening where necessary. There were conversations about forgiveness, though not in the way outsiders might expect. Forgiveness was not offered to the perpetrator, nor was it framed as moral obligation. Instead, it was internal, directed toward the past, toward choices made under pressure, toward years spent waiting without resolution. It was about releasing self-blame, not absolving harm. The concept of justice itself took on new nuance. It was no longer a singular event tied to a courtroom outcome. It was a process that unfolded over decades, shaped by technology, persistence, and chance. Justice had not arrived when it should have. It arrived when it could. That distinction mattered. In quiet moments, the family acknowledged something difficult. The truth, once revealed, did not bring peace in the way they had imagined. It brought clarity. And clarity, while stabilizing, can be heavy. Knowing the details of what had happened replaced imagination with fact. The unknown, for all its cruelty, had once left room for hope. Facts did not. But clarity also removed doubt. It eliminated the mental loops that had replayed endlessly. It stopped the mind from inventing alternatives. In that stillness, new thoughts found room to form. The story of the case began to serve a different function. It was no longer about loss alone. It became a reference for endurance, for the long arc of accountability, for the idea that truth can survive neglect if protected long enough. It carried weight without demanding attention. As life pressed forward, the case settled into its final shape, not as a defining identity, but as a formative experience. It had altered trajectories, influenced decisions, reshaped relationships. Its impact was permanent, but no longer consuming. And in that shift, something essential became clear. Resolution does not erase the past. It integrates it. It allows memory to exist without distortion, to inform without controlling. The cold case, once a symbol of absence, had become a testament to persistence, and to the quiet, complicated aftermath of knowing. Understanding settled in layers, not all at once. Some days carried a sense of normalcy so convincing it felt unreal, as if the years of tension had been imagined. Other days pulled the past forward without warning, reminding everyone involved that resolution does not erase conditioning. The mind remembers patterns long after circumstances change. The family learned to recognize these shifts without fear. Emotional fluctuations no longer signaled danger or disappointment. They were simply echoes, remnants of a long vigil finally winding down. Accepting them as natural allowed space for patience, both with themselves and with one another. There was a subtle redefinition of strength. For decades, strength had meant endurance, the ability to wait without breaking. Now it meant something else, the willingness to live fully without a singular purpose driving every choice. Letting go of vigilance required courage. It demanded trust in a future that no longer revolved around the past. Relationships evolved. Some deepened, strengthened by shared survival. Others drifted, having been bound primarily by the case itself. This separation was not painful. It felt honest. The case had once been the gravitational center. Without it, connections rebalanced naturally, revealing which bonds were rooted in shared experience and which were sustained by obligation. The solved case became a quiet benchmark in conversations about justice. Not invoked dramatically, but referenced thoughtfully. It illustrated the long-term consequences of delay, the ethical responsibility of evidence preservation, and the unpredictable role of advancement. It reminded listeners that time does not only obscure, it also protects if handled correctly. The investigators who had closed the file carried its influence forward. It sharpened their skepticism of easy answers. It reinforced their respect for unresolved details. Each new case benefited from the patience learned in that one long pursuit. The absence of urgency did not signal apathy. It signaled discipline. In private moments, the family reflected on how identity had been shaped by the waiting. Advocacy, awareness, quiet resilience. These traits did not disappear with resolution. They remained, repurposed rather than retired. The experience had left its imprint, but it no longer demanded exclusive loyalty. There were still stories untold, not because they were secret, but because they were too personal, too nuanced for public consumption. Some truths belong to memory rather than record. Choosing what to share became an act of autonomy, not avoidance. The environment itself seemed altered. Familiar streets felt less charged. Ordinary sounds, sirens, footsteps, distant voices, no longer triggered the same visceral responses. The nervous system adjusted, slowly recalibrating to a world that no longer promised sudden revelation. Occasionally, a question surfaced that had no answer even now, a moment in the timeline that remained unclear, a decision whose rationale could never be fully understood. These gaps were no longer threatening. They were acknowledged as limits of knowledge, not failures of justice. The case's resolution had not restored balance in a dramatic sense. It had introduced equilibrium quietly, almost imperceptibly. Life did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward into something new, shaped by experience but not confined by it. In that forward motion, meaning emerged not from the outcome, but from the endurance that preceded it. The waiting had taught discipline. The resolution taught acceptance. Together, they formed a narrative that resisted simplification. The cold case, once defined by absence, now existed as a complete arc, imperfect, delayed, but intact. It had asked for patience without promise, and delivered truth without ceremony. And in doing so, it left behind something rare, a conclusion that did not demand attention, only understanding. The final stage did not arrive with drama. There were no alarms, no sudden revelations, no moment that felt like an ending. Instead, it came as a quiet recognition that the case no longer followed them into every room. Its presence had thinned, diluted by time and acceptance, until one day it was simply there, without weight. The community adjusted in similar ways. For years, the case had existed as an unresolved murmur beneath everyday life, a shared discomfort never fully addressed. With the truth exposed, that murmur faded. Conversations shifted. The story stopped resurfacing as rumor and began to exist as record. That distinction mattered. Rumors haunt. Records rest. There were no celebrations. Closure did not inspire joy so much as steadiness. It grounded people. It reaffirmed the belief that persistence had value even when reward was uncertain. The case became an example cited in classrooms, training seminars, and quiet discussions between professionals who understood what it meant to wait without guarantee. The family noticed how memory itself began to behave differently. Recollections no longer looped compulsively around unanswered questions. They expanded outward, reclaiming moments that had once been overshadowed. Laughter returned to old stories. Faces remembered were no longer frozen at the moment of loss. They aged naturally in the mind, allowed to exist beyond the crime. Grief evolved. It did not disappear. It refined itself. It became less sharp, more contemplative. The ache remained, but it no longer demanded constant attention. It coexisted with daily life rather than interrupting it. The perpetrator, now known and named, gradually lost symbolic power. No longer an abstract threat or imagined presence. They became confined to their actions and their consequences. Accountability reduced their reach. The mystery had once magnified them. Truth diminished them. In this narrowing, something unexpected happened. The case stopped feeling personal and started feeling historical. Not distant, not irrelevant, but placed, positioned within time rather than suspended outside it. That shift allowed everyone involved to breathe more freely. There were moments of reflection that bordered on gratitude. Not for crime, never for the harm, but for the outcome, for the fact that answers, however delayed, had arrived at all. Many families never received that. This awareness carried humility, not relief. As years passed, the story remained intact but inactive. It no longer evolved. No new theories emerged. No speculation lingered. Its narrative had reached stability, and in that stability, its emotional charge slowly dissipated. The cold case had taught everyone involved something difficult and enduring, that truth does not obey timelines, that justice is not always swift, and that resolution is not an event but a condition that must be lived into. And as that understanding settled, the case finally loosened its grip. Not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into something quieter, something finished enough to allow life to continue without resistance. In the end, What remained was not the crime itself, but the space it left behind once it finally stopped echoing. Silence returned in a different form now, no longer heavy with anticipation, no longer sharp with unanswered questions. It was a silence that allowed thought, rest, and ordinary moments to exist without intrusion, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The case had once dictated time. Every year marked another unanswered anniversary. Every season another reminder that the truth was still somewhere out of reach. Now time moved forward without resistance. Days passed without subconscious counting. Nights arrived without the reflex to wonder what had been missed, what had gone unseen. The clock resumed its natural rhythm. The family understood something profound in this shift. Justice had not rewritten the past. It had not repaired what was taken, but it had restored continuity. Life could once again be experienced as a sequence rather than a suspension. That alone carried immense weight. There were moments, often unexpected, when the full gravity of resolution surfaced, a document filed away, a photograph no longer examined for clues, a name spoken without hesitation or anger. These small gestures signaled something larger. The case no longer demanded vigilance. It had concluded its claim. The investigators felt it too, though they rarely spoke of it, a subtle easing, a chapter closed not with triumph, but with professional respect for the process that had finally aligned. They carried the lesson quietly into future work, knowing that patience, when paired with integrity, could outlast even decades of uncertainty. The community absorbed the story fully now, not as scandal, not as mystery, but as history, a reminder of vulnerability, of error, of persistence. The case no longer unsettled people. It instructed them. It reminded them that truth could surface long after attention faded, long after hope seemed impractical. And still, the emotional residue lingered, not as pain, but as awareness, an understanding that some experiences permanently alter perception. The family did not return to who they were before. They became something else entirely, not defined by loss, not freed from it, but shaped into a deeper attentiveness to life itself. There was no final image that captured the ending, no singular scene that summed it up. Closure arrived incrementally, in ordinary acts carried out without hesitation, buying groceries without scanning faces, driving familiar roads without tension, sleeping through the night without sudden clarity or dread. The cold case, once an open wound, had healed into a scar, visible, permanent, but no longer painful. It told a story without reopening it. It existed as proof that something terrible had happened, and that it had finally been acknowledged. And so the narrative ended not with a revelation, but with continuity, with lives proceeding forward, unanchored from the past at last. The truth had emerged, not to shock, but to settle, to close a loop stretched thin across decades, to return the unanswered to the answered. What remained was not mystery, but memory, not pursuit, but presence. And in that quiet aftermath, the case released its hold, leaving behind only this: the knowledge that even the longest shadows can eventually be outrun by time.